Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing fine. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and also I'm really thankful for the possibility of making the presentation in this digital format. I might have to stop at some point in the presentation, even it's a video, so I'm going to edit it, I guess, because I am a single mother of a 3-year-old who is sleeping at the moment upstairs, and I hope he doesn't wake up. Well, as you might know, the situation here in Spain, where I live, is quite complex at the moment. There is a quite high number of people who have lost their lives due to coronavirus, and there is also a moment that maybe you might not know because it doesn't appear in the news, that has to do with the military approach that the government has decided to take in regard to the lockdown policy. And obviously, this has increased enormously the situation of violence towards migrant and racialized populations and communities, which already existed, but at the moment is quite harder. I will speak a little bit about that at the end of the presentation because I think it's important to maybe not deeply analyze the situation because it's like a whole new panorama, but a whole new panorama with, let's say, institutions and structures and in a society that we already know. Well, as you might know, I am Peruvian and I have been living in Spain for the last 12 years. And it's from my experience as a migrant person and with immigration office that I started making a research to understand how law is used by institutions in order to inflict violence towards migrant and racialized populations, and also to understand how the actual migratory control system is an extension of the colonial order inside Europe. It's the way Europe has found to inflict the same violence that puts on the global south, but within their borders. No, it's the way that they found. It is, let's say, the legal structure that they found to create, and I will address it specifically later, to create the figure of the illegal immigrant in order to reproduce the exploitation, violence, persecution, etc., and control of populations that are called migrants here, but that we all know is specifically people that come from former colonies. No? Also, the approach I will have is not only to law in general, but specifically to, and in a way, to immigration laws, but also to human rights policies and how the speech and the notion of human rights has been also used to reinforce this violence system. And I would like to begin this going back in history to see two cases that can be interesting to understand how these claims of injustice towards populations of the global south, racialized people, migrant people, can turn then into a reinforcement of the legal system that inflicts violence towards them if we don't approach that claim by a radical anti-colonial speech. The image you are seeing is an image made by Theodore de Bry, based on the testimony of Bartolomé de las Casas that you might have listened, was a Spanish priest that was at the beginning of what they call the conquest and what I would call the invasion of Abya Yala, of the territories that they call Latin America. And de Bry shows this image of an Spaniard giving babies to the dogs that are eating the babies. And I would like to read the fragment of the text of Bartolomé de las Casas that explains this, that was, let's say, the description that Debris used to wield this image. No one can believe the particular narrations of the barbarism and cruelty in those lands. I will only relate 2 or 3 stories which are fresh in my memory. The Spaniards used to trace the steps of the Indians, both men and women with furious dogs. An Indian woman that was sick happened to be in the way inside, who, perceiving that she was not able to avoid being torn in pieces by the dogs, takes a cord that she had and hangs herself, tying her child, which she unfortunately had with her, to her foot. And no sooner has she done, yet the dogs were at her, tearing the child. But a priest coming that way to baptize the child before they were dead. It's really interesting to analyze the figure of the priest here, really interesting and important to analyze it, and then also to analyze the narration of Bartolomé de las Casas in relation to the priest and in relation to his own role, no? Because even though in a way he was denouncing, no, this violence done by the Spaniards and that were giving the babies to the dogs and inflicting all this violence, but at the same time he never questioned, for example, the fact that the priest was not confronting the Spanish people in order to stop doing that violence, but he was baptized the child, so he goes with the Christian Catholic God that actually was, as you might know, one of the biggest arguments used in the process of invasion was the religious fact, and considering at the beginning that indigenous people didn't have souls, therefore they were animals, no? And actually the claim of Bartolomé de las Casas when he does all this narration in the book called Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies, which obviously tells all this brutality, but I would propose to have a critical view in regard to Bartolomé de las Casas in 2 facts. One, that he doesn't question the church, which is interesting, and then here we can see, no, that he approaches this, let's say, charity paternalistic notion that the priest is helping them by baptizing the dead child and not confronting the Spaniard that is inflicting violence towards his people. But then also, the other fact that is important to understand Bartolomé de las Casas is that he doesn't question colonialism itself. He claims for a more humanitarian way of dealing with the colonial order imposed in Abya Yala. He's not claiming for the total liberation of indigenous people from the Spanish crown. He's not claiming for white settlers to go back to their lands. He's claiming to have not only like a more humanitarian treatment with them, which then derivates in the debate de los naturales, the debate of the naturals, that then I will explain. But the proposal of Bartolomé de las Casas is to integrate, and then we will see how these policies of integration, of assimilation of people from the global south into the Eurocentric, Catholic, Christian, capitalist type of life, it has been a constant in history, no? Until nowadays. We can see that we as migrants are being always requested to integrate into the way of understanding life from a European perspective, no? And Bartolomé de las Casas' proposal, and let's say the most progressive people that were in the Spanish power that then creates the debate de los naturales, the proposal is to Christianize these people, to consider that they are not animals because they have a soul, no? So this debate of the naturals, debate de los naturales, comes, no? And then they take the decision that yes, indigenous people have souls, they are not animals, therefore they can be Christianized and integrated into the system, no? So, and in that point, I think it's really important to have a critical view in regard to Bartolomé de las Casas, because he's not only narrated as a founding father of the human rights, a founding father of international law, but he has been always narrated as a defender of indigenous people, which is not real because he was part of the colonial power, and then his proposal was, let's say, to create and to reform the system in order to humanize an exploitation and an invasion process, which is an oxymoron and it's impossible to have, no? So after the Debate de los Naturales, what happened is that, is that they created what we know as the law of Indies, las leyes de Indias, that were the first laws created to be applied in the viceroyalties of Peru and Mexico, and then in the whole context of the territories invaded in Abya Yala. For example, something really interesting to have on account here with the law of Indies and the whole Debate de los Naturales is that African black people that were enslaved at the moment, for example, didn't enter to be considered by Bartolomé de las Casas and all the more humanitarian colonizers, no, as humans. And actually Bartolomé de las Casas, in many moments, and then that's something that we can see reflected in the laws, had even the proposal that in order to do not kill and exploit in such a hard way indigenous people that were already considered humans with souls, obviously humans not in the same category as Spaniards and European and white people, no, humans that had to be integrated, no, but humans on top of black African people that were being enslaved, no, and the proposal was to bring more people from African territories in order to be the absolute exploited workforce, no? So indigenous people wouldn't live such an exploitation, no? Exploitation also, but in another way, no? And that's something really interesting to see, for example, how this notion, no, of not giving humanity to African people was translated into the law of Indies, for example, in a policy that explained that entering into the mines and working with the azogue, with the mercury, was too risky for the health, no, which is something risky until now, with industrial mining and all these kind of extractivist systems. But the proposal in the law of Indies was that black people should be the ones that go into the mines to do that work that was so risky, so indigenous people would do another work and, as I said, be exploited, but not as exploited as black people. It's also really interesting that in the law of Indies, they also mention Roma people, no? And how also in another way different than black enslaved people, indigenous exploited people, Roma people were also conditionated as obviously racialized non-white European people to do not have certain rights, no? So this new, let's say, legal frame was imposed in the invaded territories, obviously, and as we will see in many other legal frames that have been created in order to legalize and legitimize violence, it's a legal frame where indigenous people and the people that were under that law obviously never took part and never were part of the process of creating this law, no? And in that sense, even though if it comes, let's say, with what they call good intentions, no, or more humanitarian intentions, then this turns into let's say an oppressive system that comes with paternalism. Actually, it's really interesting to see that many of the representations, as you can see in the image of Bartolomé de las Casas in different monuments, it's always he on top and indigenous people naked on their knees, and him being protective with them. No, so the colonial power relation is still existing. No. Obviously, the whole racist representation is still existing. Therefore, figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas was never a counterpart to colonialism, but was the good face of colonialism, which always have been needed. You always need like this kind of paternalistic narratives that infantilizes racialized people from the global south, migrant people, in order to take away their autonomy and to do not let these communities to have, let's say, their own political positions, to oppress them in that sense, no? And then obviously then we have the most criminalization, violence, etc., no? But always, I think it's really interesting to think that paternalism has always been a useful tool for colonialism. And then, obviously, what ended up happening, like it happens usually with these legal systems created by European forces or white supremacy forces, is that they end up normativizing, legalizing violence and normalizing this type of violence, no? And making it making a process of legitimation of this violence because it's legal. And in the Eurocentric Occidental notion, law is thought as justice, when law has never been justice to the people of the global south and to racialized migrant people, etc. No, law, on the contrary, has been the tool for excellence used by Europe in order to inflict violence. Also, something really important, what I was telling you before, we're talking about 16th century, Bartolomé de las Casas, the law of Indies, the debate de los naturales, etc. And then this image we are seeing, we're talking about 17th century. It is one of the amazing images done by the indigenous chronist Huamampoma de Ayala that I deeply recommend, because he's one of the first indigenous chronists to write in Spanish and in Quechua, and he made this amazing book that then I can send you the link so you can investigate. And I think it's this book is one of the most important anti-colonial documents. And Huamampoma in the book, and we are talking, as I say, after post law of Indies, which are actually in Spain is really strong how they narrated us. We were so progressive and good with indigenous people in Abya Yala that we even consider them humans and give them the law of Indies, and the law of Indies are always narrated as a protective tool when we will see now, for example, with these denounces of Huamampoma de Ayala, that the violence towards indigenous people didn't stop with the law of Indies, but continue, and it continues obviously until now, no? But well, one of the I choose to show this image because I think it's really important to show, for example, something that is super important in the sense of how law has been a tool for inflicting violence, that has to do with the fact that law is written. No, not only that law is written by the people who are in power, in a power structure where oppressed people do not have access to, or maybe they have one representative or two, but it's not their own power structure or political structure, let's say, no? But then there is something else, that law is written, and written, and la escritura, no, and the fact of who writes and who doesn't write, who reads and who speaks Spanish and who didn't speak Spanish, was a big tool to reinforce power, no? That indigenous people didn't have access to learn to write and read in Spanish, because obviously it was not their culture, it was not their way of organizing, communicating, narrating, etc. And it's really interesting that until nowadays, the power of writing, and we can see that clearly in academia, no, has this kind of continuous way of reinforcing the power of Europe, no? Oral history, orality, that has been something really important, for example, for the memory, for the cultures, for the political organization, for the resistance of indigenous communities, of communities who have lived colonial violence, that rip away many of their other cultural practices of putting together the information, no, is not considered as important as written, no, because written is a tool of Europeans, no, and I consider that really important to think about la escritura as a tool of power, and then also that law is always written, many times not in our languages, no? For me it's really interesting, for example, to think that the immigration laws in the context, for example, in Spain, many times, let's say immigration law applies to people, for example, that do not speak Spanish and is not even translated to the languages of the people that the law is going to be applied, but is the law is only written in Spanish and maybe sometimes in English. That is the language of the person, of the group of people that imposes this law towards that other group of people, no? Also, this other image is really interesting. In Guamampoma, he talks about the special hate that Spaniards have towards those Ladinos indigenous. Ladino is a term that means an indigenous person, but that he has been already Christianized and speaks Spanish and has, like, let's say, some kind of Spanish costumes, no? And Guamampoma describes the special hate that Spanish have towards these indigenous people that know how to read and write, because they knew how to write the claims against the violence inflicted towards their communities, no? And and there we can see again how knowing how to read and write and knowing how to access law, no, this other barrier in regard to law has been also a space of power for colonialism, no, that we can think up and to our days, no. For example, then we will see some immigration laws that is not only the fact of the language and the fact that it's written, but also the type of terminology, no? For example, we have terms as joint return operations, which means collective deportation, but juridical language uses a whole also strategy in order to erase any trace of violence and to make it look like everything is fair or correct, etc., no? Then these other images I will show you is only to understand that even though the law of Indies were already working for more than 100 years at the moment, exploitation and violence towards indigenous communities was prevailing. Here you can see, for example, a servant for white people, then an indigenous man being harassed by a white person. Then, for example, the whole thing about paying taxes, no, that has been a huge tool of the church at the moment, and then also of the colonial power itself. Then an Spaniard killing an indigenous person. And, well, there are all types of violence that you can see in the Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno of Guamampoma de Ayala, that then I can send you the link. Another figure that is interesting to understand, and it's like quite similar to Wamampoma Ayala, but in another century, is Gustave Moynier, that you might know. He's a Swiss jurist. He's another father of international law. And he's a founding father of the Red Cross, which is one of the most important Western European humanitarian agencies. Actually, he appears here together with Gustave Moynier, with Henri Dunant and all the other people from the Red Cross. But also, Gustave Moynier was not only a member of the Red Cross, he was not only a jurist, but he also created this magazine called L'Afrique explorée et civilisée, Africa Explored and Civilized, which is also really interesting to think in regard to Bartolomé de las Casas, no? That his notion was to integrate into Christianity, no? To indigenous people, but Gustave Moynier, when he talks about Africa, not only Moynier, but all the people, all the jurists, intellectuals, politicians, etc., that were part of the colonial power, they were at that moment talking about civilization, no, in the 19th century, no, and this is the let's say the second round of colonization, no, Christianization and then civilization, no. And Gustave Moynier has this, and we have to know that he's a huge figure in regard to human rights. He's a founding father of also international law. Actually, he's the he's part of the group that founded the Institute of International Law. No, so he has this this quite big role in the context of human rights and law, and he has been obviously always been read as a defendant of people, vulnerable people, etc., mostly with his role in the Red Cross, that we will also see further on in regard to their work nowadays with the migratory control system. But besides that, Gustave Moynier wrote this text called The Foundation of the Independent State of Congo from a juridical point of view. And I would like to read you a little fragment of that text, and it says, "The foundation of the independent state of Congo is related to a philanthropic movement which, given its social and economical consequences, not to mention its moral side, is up to the task of correcting the perspective of scholars. After the despising and cruelty exploiting the blacks while denying for several centuries that they were congeners, white people finally regretted their action. They started condemning the slave trade and subsequently empowered their own African slaves. Following this, upon the realization that they ought to make amends to people whose natural rights were unknown to them, they now aspire to spread among these people the benefits of civilization." As you maybe know, the Belgian invasion to Congo had by the Belgian crown. At a certain point, they took the decision to create the Congo, the independent state of Congo, that was not obviously independent from Belgium, but was under the crown of and the power of Belgians. And something really important to take note on this is that the speech at the moment, I mean, like nowadays, the narrative of Belgian colonization and Leopold II and the role of Leopold II in Congo is that obviously he inflicted violence, etc. But at the moment, the narrative that was created, it was a philanthropic, as Gustave Moner says in his text, it was a philanthropic work done by Leopold II because they built this narrative that what they wanted to do is to civilize Congo, but also, and most important, the first notion that they used is that they were going to liberate Black people from Congo from slavery. Because at the moment we are talking that the anti-slavery movement and the liberation is starting to happen, and the response to that from Leopold II was, I'm going to make a country to civilize and develop a country, imposed obviously with a nation state, with the notions and the economical system, the history we know about Congo and exploitation, 6 million people killed, a whole system of extractivism of rubber, but the narrative that was put is that he was going to help Congo to civilize and develop, no, and in order to avoid slavery. Actually, it's really interesting to see this monument that is in Brussels. As you know, well, Brussels is full of colonial monuments. Actually, this is a still frame of the movie that I made called The Empire of the Law, that also I will send the link. The movie that I made it last year approaches many of the issues that I'm talking about now, but well, it's only a 30 minutes movie, so it doesn't go that deep as I'm going to go today in certain issues, but it goes, it creates a critical narrative of law as a tool for colonialism through diverse monuments and buildings in the context of Belgium and Peru. But well, the thing with this monument that it's in a park in Brussels, and it's a monument to the heroes or to the Belgian heroes that help Congolese people to liberate from who? From the Arab slave traders, no, and from slavery, no. So it's really interesting how they incorporate themselves, and they were narrating themselves as taking civilization and developing the country and liberating them. No, it's something very similar to the narrative of America in regard to the invasion of Iraq, no, for example, or something really similar to the narratives that we have in regard to the invasion of Abya Yala, Latin America, with all this kind of Christianizing civilization process that liberate us from the brutality of the Incas and the Mayas, etc. No? And there is always this constant narrative of Europe in their processes of invasion and exploitation and death that has to do with a supposed liberation. No? And actually in the monument you can see this that Arabs are represented as like animals. No? Here there is, for example, a crocodile. At the beginning, here there is a crocodile that is going to attack a black person. Then there is an eagle also that is attacking another black person, etc. And Belgians that at the moment were the ones who were killing, murdering, mutilating Congolese people are narrated, self-narrated, obviously, as the protectors of Congolese people, no? And well, now going to a more contemporary context, and what I would like to focus more is on the European migratory control system and its legal strategies and process. This is a cover of a newspaper of 1985. So at that moment, Spain was signing their final agreements in order to enter the European Economical Community and also the Schengen area, the European Union, etc. No? And obviously to enter that community, and mostly the Schengen area, had not only, for example, the request of changing to euro coin or to change certain policies, etc. But one of the requests that happened at the moment was to be part of the Schengen area, which is narrated as a non-border area. This is the moment where the Schengen Agreement was signed. And actually one of the politicians has this no customs sign, or the sign about customs with a cross, saying there is not going to be customs and control, and we're going to have free trade and free movement of white people in order to reinforce the capitalist system through the movement, the free movement of goods and white European people, no? But at the same time, when we talk about Schengen, no, let's say Schengen for white European people, it is an area of freedom of movement and freedom of capitals, but at the same time, Schengen is the name of the visa they request you in order to enter Europe. No, actually, it's the visa that I requested in 2007 when I moved to Spain. It took me more than 1 year to be able to obtain that visa, even though I come from a middle-class mestizo family. I was coming as an student, which is an absolute privileged way of entering Europe. But even though I had that situation, I had to request that visa that, as I mentioned, is called Schengen, and it's really interesting to see, that the same word that means an area of freedom of movement for white European people means the system that is creating a border, a deadly border, a racist border, a border of institutional racism for non-European, non-white people coming from former colonies. Actually, something that I like to mention in regard to the Schengen visa is that, for example, at the moment, I was requested to even have blood tests for tuberculosis and also for syphilis, and then an X-ray of my lungs for tuberculosis, not for a student visa, no. But what I wanted to point mostly in regard to Schengen is that at the moment that they create this freedom of movement area, they also create let's say the contemporary migratory control system that nowadays, as I explained before, is the way to enforce colonial order that was always working from Europe to the south, no, or from northern countries to the south, no, and but to reinforce that system inside. For example, to create an absolute exploited working force with that doesn't have the same rights as white European workers, and that is able to function because they have an immigration law that creates that difference in regard to workers' rights, to women's rights, to diverse situations. No, so and then also each country that would enter the European Union, the Schengen area, the European Economical Community, had the request of creating diverse laws. In the case of Spain, they asked also to create the immigration law, Ley de Extranjería, that was imposed in 1985. Something really important to point out in regard to this law is that was created by a left-wing government, the PSOE, actually the government that is on power nowadays. No, but we are talking about the PSOE of 1985, just after dictatorship, that was supposed to be a really progressive left-wing party, etc. But they were the ones that imposed these immigration laws, not only to migrants that come afterwards, but to people, to foreigners coming from former colonies that were already living in Spain. That's something really important to have in mind, that when they impose that law, they, on one hand, create the figure of the immigrant in a legal figure, and this legal figure, what contains is all the social racism that existed before. No, if you see, for example, in the newspapers before 1985, in the Spanish newspapers, they would never talk about immigrants and neither illegal immigrants. No, that is nowadays the political figure that the nomenclature that is used to designate those racialized people coming from former colonies. No, but before that, the reference in regard to those communities was always the Latin Americans, the Moroccans, etc. They were talking more about ethnicity. No, what happens when the immigration law is created, and with the figure of the political figure of the immigrant and the illegal immigrant, is that they also erase any trace of ethnicity, even though everybody knows that illegal immigrant or immigrant equals a racialized person coming from the global south, no, or coming from a former colony, no, or being a second, third generation from someone from a former colony, let's say being a racialized person, no, even though everybody knows that, what happens when this figure is created is that it kind of erase any trace of racism, because also we are talking of a moment of a creation of a supposedly progressive human rights, European Union, etc. No, so they need to create a new figure that will contain racism. So now you have people that can tell you, no, I am not racist. I am just saying that illegal immigrants shouldn't come here because they are illegal, etc. Even obviously without understanding how the legal system works and how obviously this system was created in order, as I said before, to enforce an exploitation, persecution, detention, deportation system inside the European Union to inflict violence towards those people coming from former colonies, and to, again, do not recognizing them as equals, no? And then also something really important that happened in 1985 in the context of Spain is that there were, as I said, already communities and people from the former colonies living inside Spain, living racism, obviously. They were experiencing racism already, but in another shape. But from one day to another, with imposition of the immigration law, they were illegalized. They were suddenly considered illegal immigrants, and they had to go through all the bureaucratic system that, through the law, is a way, is a, let's say, a bureaucratic system that it is created in order for you to not to be able to have a residency card, therefore to be in risk of a detention and a deportation. Going back to these kind of human rights paternalistic notions and how they have been systematically used in the colonial system in order to inflict violence towards people from the global south. Something really interesting is that this cover, for example, that you are seeing, also talks about the Queen of Spain bringing charity and hope to Colombia, no? Like, and how these type of narratives from Bartolomé Las Casas prevails until nowadays. But what I want you to focus on is on the image of the demonstration. It's a demonstration organized by white Spanish people in Melilla, that is an occupied territory in the north of Africa, an occupied territory by Spain in the north of Africa. And it was a demonstration, and I'm saying, no? We're talking about at the moment, post-dictatorship, no demonstrations were allowed, etc. And we're talking about a socialist party on power, etc. But it was a demonstration organized by white people in the city of Melilla that has a big population of Moroccan people or Moroccan descent people, and the demonstration organized by white Spanish people had the sign yes to the immigration law. And what is really important to take on account here, it says for the Constitution, no, that at the moment was this progressive left-wing moment, etc., and for human rights, no, the immigration law that starts the whole system of detention, persecution, and deportation of migrant people, and this whole institutional racism was defended at the first moment as a law that was going to defend human rights. No? At the same moment, we have this news that was not on the cover, obviously, of the repression to the demonstrations organized by mostly Muslim Moroccan communities living in Melilla, also in Spain already, no? And actually the first demonstration against the immigration law, denouncing it as a racist law, was organized by a group of Moroccan women, and obviously the authorities didn't give them authorization or any permission to use the public space, which is also really interesting how law works there, no? How this huge white people demonstration pro-immigration law was permitted, but at the same time the demonstration of those who were going to be subjects of the immigration law was forbidden, and this Muslim group of women, and at the first moment considered or like new considered immigrant women in Melilla, that maybe more of them were living already 20, 30 years there, was forbidden, and therefore there was a lot of repression against that demonstration. It is also really interesting, and here you can see how this massive illegalization of people, and it works until now, created this bureaucratic violence, no, of not only having requirements in order to get the permission that are really difficult to get, like as a working contract, penal records, having enough money, and the diverse requirements that they always put in order for us to do not be able to get a residency permit, no, but then also the thing that has to do with the waiting time, no. It's amazing that in Spain there are millions of Spanish that can get their ID card every year when they turn 18, or when they need to renew it, or when they have to get their passport. But when it comes to migrant populations, that we are a minority in numbers, then the bureaucratic system doesn't work. And you can see this image from 1985. We were already making queue at the moment, and we make queue until now. And now, for example, something that happens systematically is that there are no appointments in the immigration office. You can take up to 3-4 months in order to get an appointment to bring the documentation you need to renew or to ask for a residency permit. That is obviously a way in which institutional racism has found to do not let us have access to a residency permit. But something really important of this news is that it talks about migrant communities and associations already in 1985 denouncing that, that this immigration law was racist, on a hand, something that even the white left wing doesn't even denounce sometimes, but also denouncing that this immigration law would open the doors to collective and massive deportation of migrant people. So this is something really important, because that's a debate that has been, that it took more than 30 years to arrive to the media and to NGOs and to all the left-wing apparatus in regard to migrants' rights, no? Until the agreement of the EU with Turkey, that it was the first time that I listened people discussing how a law would open the possibility of collective deportation, something that has been happening since 1985 on one hand, at least in the context of Spain, but also in the other countries. But that was already denounced as not only institutional racism, but also as a law that was going to open the door to collective deportations by migrant associations that obviously, and as it happens until now, are never listened, no? Also, it's really interesting, for example, this news that says, no, Barcelona, 24 hours in the street in order to get legalized, no? And then I reinforce this notion to think also that let's say the terrain, the area where the colonial power is enforced nowadays in the context of Europe has to do precisely with legality, no, as illegalized migrants and the legalization or illegalization of yourself. It is, and to be considered, let's say, a citizen or a semi-citizen, no, it is what gives you or takes away humanity, no? The systematic killing of migrant people in border areas has to do precisely with this notion of considering them illegal, therefore they are killable, let's say. They can kill them because they are illegalized. They can detain you, deport you, hit you, etc. because you are illegal, no? And it's really interesting that even one of the main terms used in racism, in colonial racism nowadays, is precisely illegal immigrant, no? And then, well, this is just to show that deportations, for me, it's really important to see in these newspapers from the mid-80s, because deportations have been happening since there. Every time there is a deportation, a video, or an abuse, the media and the powers of the left wing and the human rights agencies, etc., want to make it look as it's a mistake, an error of the system, and something that it happened just now, last week. For example, like if it happens that there is a deportation and there is a recording of that deportation and we can see the violence, or if somebody or a group of people is being killed in the border, they always want to narrate it as if something that happened just now. And no, in Europe, they have been killing, persecuting, detaining, deporting, and inflicting all type of violence towards migrant people for the last 30 years using this legal system. And collective deportations, also individual deportations, have been carrying on since the 80s with the left wing or the right wing in the government, no? And for example, here there are some images of and here the headline explains clear that immigration law has already created 217 deportations, no? And is like 6 months after the cover we saw before, where the immigration law was supposedly to protect human rights and for the Spanish constitution, no? So, what is the outcome of these 30 years of the imposition of the immigration law in Spain? Around more than 20,000 people death in the border areas. Actually, there is not an exact number because there is no institution, organization, or body from the state that is taking account of this number of people who are dead and disappear, and that actually, if the bodies are found, many times they go through a process of second disappears when they are buried without any process of identification, no? And well, the image you are seeing is a list of 15,000 cases of no names, but in a European level, we are talking about more than 50,000 people dead and disappear in borders areas since the imposition of immigration laws in the context of Spain. It's really important to be conscious that the death in border areas is not a product of an accident, it's not a product of Europe not seeing what is going on in the borders. Actually, certain left-wing, white left-wing groups, when they claim against the murders in border areas, they have this speech that Europe is not seeing what is happening there. Europe is absolutely conscious, and as I say, the death in border areas is an outcome of the imposition of immigration laws. Actually, in Spain, the first death happened in November of 1987. As you can see, this is a cover from 1992, but talks about the death of 1987, no? And the two first migrant people who died in the Spanish border areas were just 2 years after the imposition of the immigration laws. So if there is any type of political group that is against the death of migrant people in border areas, the only solution for that is the abolition of the immigration law, which actually in the anti-racist movement I am part of is our claim, like no reform, no change. We want abolition of the immigration law that creates this death. And then also it's really important to see in this news from the 90s, from the 80s, etc., that the presence of dead bodies and dead migrant people in the media is a constant. So then when we are in 2013 and then Lampedusa happens and suddenly there are a lot of people dead in borders, and Europe and the media and the politicians want to make themselves look as surprised as if an accident happened, it's clear that Europe knows and has been living together with the murder of people in border areas, which ends up with this constant presence of bodies of children, migrant people, migrant women, death in the media, and this constant appearance of racialized people receiving violence ends up normalizing this situation and naturalizing this death. Together with the presence of nature and in concrete with the Mediterranean Sea and also the Ebros River that I will explain now. But something that for me is really important to understand is that even though racism happened in other ways before the late 80s where immigration laws were imposed, the way racism is imposed after the late 80s is through the immigration laws that create death in border areas, and it's a direct outcome of that law. A few years ago, I found this video by David Cameron, and he was talking about how lucky was UK because it was surrounded by water, and how water protected UK from illegal immigrants, no? And he said it clearly, like we have the advantage, we have the natural advantage of our sea border, no? That made me think in a clear thing that is how Europe has been using nature and natural borders as a tool for murdering people in border areas, on a way as a tool for creating and reinforcing a border, but also for killing people in border areas, no? And how this is not an accident, these are not accidents, this is not an outcome of ensavaged in the racist notion of the savage, no, that Europe uses, that creates this notion of savage people coming from former colonies that put their lives on risk, and invisibilizing the whole system that exists for creating that situation. Obviously, we have a whole legal system that forbids visas and the process of taking an airplane or a ferry in order to enter Europe. No, we have a whole bureaucratic legal system that avoids that. I'm not going to focus on explaining that at the moment. And then there is a whole apparatus of control in border areas that has to do with the use of nature as a tool for killing people, migrant people in border areas. For example, Frontex, the migratory control agency of the European Union, has a contract with companies such as Meteo Group, that is a meteorological company that gives them reports of the climate, the weather on border areas in certain days. So then Frontex and the Coast Guards decide to make operatives or not to make operatives depending on the weather. And many times when there is good weather, and therefore there are more chances of migrant people trying to enter Europe through those natural borders, they do make operatives in order to avoid that situation, as the image you are seeing here, that actually is the image used by Meteo Group when they presented that they have had contracts with the European Union and Frontex to give them information of the weather, no? And then when there is bad weather, when there is wind, there is a storm, whatever, even though if there is a boat or whatever, they do not make cooperatives, so they let's say, let nature do the dirty work of killing that people. No, also, for example, in the area of Ebros River, many times what Frontex have been doing and the authorities of the European Union and member states is to close certain areas that were easy for crossing and leaving open the ones that were dangerous and that would end up killing migrant people. And then the media completes this operation by what? By creating this kind of headlines in which the blame, the responsibility of the death is put on the Mediterranean Sea or in the Ebros River, no? And even, for example, like this type of headline, no? Hundreds of migrants fear death in latest Mediterranean tragedy. They were swallowed by the waves, no? It's nature who kills migrants and racialized people, and not the migratory control system, not Fabrice Leggeri, who's the director of Frontex, not the racist policies, not the European colonial order, but it's nature, no? So it's really interesting how this way of relating with nature that Eurocentric notions have, usually extractivism. I mean, like I won't focus on that, but like I also have an extension of my research that you can see actually in the Empire of the Law that approaches also the law in regard to extractivism. No, not only Europe through law has imposed an ideology with nature, that nature is just a resource to be used and exploited, but then here in the border areas they go even further to the point of using nature as a tool for giving death to migrant people, and then having the media using this type of headlines, no, like the Mediterranean Sea disaster swallowed up 1,000 migrants, to invisibilize who are the ones who are responsible for this death, and also to blame on nature the situation of violence in border area. No, the same happens, for example, with Ebros River in the border of Turkey with Greece. No, I will give a couple more of examples in regard of how these legalities work in the migratory control system in the European Union, and how they legalize violence. In the context of Spain, until the year 2010, immigrant detention centers were not a public issue. They existed, migrant population knew they existed, but like the regular white middle-class citizen didn't know they existed, even though legally they existed since 1985 and formally since the 90s. And the appearance on the debate of immigrant detention center happened after the death of Samba Martínez and Idrissa Diallo during their detention, one in the immigrant detention center of Aluche in Madrid, and the other one in the immigrant detention center of Barcelona. Obviously, there were deaths prior to this, the death of Idrissa Diallo, the death of Mohamed Abaghi, the death of Jonathan Sisa Lima, and the death of other migrant people who were detained over there. But there was no discussion about that. But what happened with the death or murder of Idrissa Diallo and Samba Martinez was that they were like 15 days one apart each other, so it became like an issue in the media that two people have died with 15 days apart from each other during their detention before being deported. What was the response of the state in regard to this situation? They said, okay, we are going to make a normative, a regulation, a protocol to see how immigrant detention centers should work. And what they did was, I'm going to resume this and not explain, because I don't have too much time, and not explain in detail how, but what they did was to legalize and therefore legitimize, normativize all the functions that the immigrant detention center was already having. And at the same time, like Bartolomé de las Casas, obviously they didn't question the institutional racism state itself, the colonial order or whatever, but what they do is they make a protocol on how immigrant detention centers should work, including all type of violence, like, for example, the fact of using different types of restraint, the fact of using solitary confinement cells, the fact they even normativize the fact of the detention of pregnant women, women who were giving breastfeeding, children, etc. So basically what they did was reinforce the system by normativizing it as a political answer to the death or murder of two migrant people in detention. And I say death of murder because it will never be clear what happened with these cases. And when it comes to suicides, that happen quite a lot in immigrant detention centers, is people who suicide under the custody of the state and under the violence and pressure of the state. Also, in this same path, we can see, for example, the case of the murder of Idrissa Diallo, that he was murdered during his deportation in a commercial flight from Madrid to Nigeria. Two policemen murdered him by causing him an asphyxia, and then he had a heart attack when he was trying to make resistance against his deportation. And again, the answer of the state was to create a protocol and to normativize and legalize all the processes of violence in regard to deportation processes. No? So when there was a debate and a denounce, and obviously the two policemen never went to jail, they pay a fine of I think 600 euros or something like that, and it was considered like like some type of like legal mistake that they made with the murder, etc. And the political answer of the state was to create this protocol for deportations that end up, again, normativizing and legalizing all the processes of violence. And actually, in this protocol for deportations, they do not only make a whole list of all the tools they can use to restrain the person and to exercise violence towards the person, but then they legalize the use of sedatives during the processes of deportation. That is a practice that is absolutely legal in the context of Europe and in United States. And when migrant people put resistance to their deportations, it is legal to inject sedatives in order to avoid the resistance. Actually, the Spanish code from 2007 worked as a tool for the creation of the code of conduct during joint return operations, that's collective deportations organized by Frontex, where also, for example, not only all these types of restraints are, like physical restraints are used, but this more violent restraint, which is the injection of a sedative in order to be able to take to make the deportation. This is the guide for joint return operations by air coordinated by Frontex, which is the protocol used by Frontex in order to carry on forced deportations in charter flights where they don't deport one person, but they deport 200, which is actually, and I'm not going to explain the whole process because I don't have time now, which is actually really interesting to analyze legally, because in the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union and in the Convention of Human Rights of the European Union, it is prohibited in only one line to make collective expulsion of not European citizens, but the European Union found a legal explanation in order to be able to make these charter flights with 200 people deported forcibly, which is to say that those flights are not considered a collective deportation because each person has an individual expulsion order. Let's say that means bureaucratically they are individual, no, even though they are put 300 people, 200 people in an airplane forcibly, etc. But bureaucratically they only have they have their own orders, each one of them, so it's not considered collective, which is really interesting also as a strategy of how law works for making a specific interpretation of a reality that is 300 people being deported, but bureaucratically and legally it is considered that is not collective because each one has an individual order of deportation. Then something that always comes to my mind is to think that then the Holocaust was nothing collective, it was individual, because the Nazis also put numbers to each person, and bureaucratically there was photos, documents of each one of them individually, no? But I wanted to go through the guide for return operations because there is something really interesting here. This is an outcome of the work, as they explain here, of the Frontex Consultative Forum. And what is the Frontex Consultative Forum? The Frontex Consultative Forum is a platform created by Frontex, which, as I said, is a migratory control agency of the European Union, let's say the border police, border military of the European Union. And they created this Frontex Consultative Forum in order to ask human rights agencies to help them to create policies so they do not violate human rights in the processes of persecution, detention, and deportation of people, which is an oxymoron because that would never happen, no? If we would think not in the colonial terms of human rights and legality and etc. So this platform counts with the collaboration of, and actually they appear in the website of Frontex that hyper-visibilizes their collaboration in this platform with Caritas, with Amnesty International, with the European Union Agency of Fundamental Rights, with the International Commission for Jurists, with the European Council of Refugees and Exiles, with the European Asylum Support Office, with the International Organization for Migration, with the Red Cross Office, and with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, which means all the biggest agency of the human rights industry collaborate with Frontex through this consultative forum, no, supposedly to advise them on how not to violate human rights. But then when we go and see the outcome of their work, that is, for example, this guide for joint return operations, here, for example, they legalize also the use of sedatives during processes of deportation, and I'm not going to go deeply into the document because it's a quite high document, but I can send it to you if you want to check it. Actually, it's public, but here again, for example, they have this part where they say the use of sedatives to facilitate the removal is forbidden without prejudice to emergency measures to ensure the flight security, which means they can use sedatives in order to deport. And they also talk about, at the end, of different techniques of restraint, no? And this is the outcome of the work done by this platform where all this agency of the human rights industry collaborate. Then another interesting case to see of the collaboration of the human rights agencies and industry with the migratory control system and how they help institutions that exercise racism and violence towards migrants migrants communities is, for example, the role of the European Union Ombudsman, that she made a whole investigation of how and a whole process of revision of how the processes of deportations were working in the context of joint return operations, let's say collective deportations, no? And for example, it's really interesting that the ombudsman never questioned the deportation itself as a violation of the human rights, neither the fact that there were collective deportations that were against even their own legality, you know, that is what I explained before of the Charter of Human Rights. And then the only recommendation she had is this that appears here. No, she calls on the agency to ensure that families with children and pregnant women are seated separately from other returnees. She accepts, the ombudsman accepts the fact of deporting pregnant women and children, and the only protection she ensures is that they don't sit with other returnees, let's say other migrant male, that can be violent towards them, no? And therefore reinforcing, normalizing, and cleaning the image of the processes of deportation. Then we have these same agencies using constantly and for years the image of racialized and migrant people living the conditions of those systems these agencies work for, reinforce, work together with, through, for example, the Frontex Consultative Forum, no, using the image and the situation they are living in border areas created by those institutions they work with, no, and in order to collect money for supposedly helping them. But then also normalizing and reinforcing once again, as we saw the media did before, the situation of migrant and racialized people living in violent situations, and having the only answer to this violence, not confronting the colonial racist power, institutional racism of the European Union, but saying we are going to make charity and help them, no? In the same logic of Gustave Moiner, in the same logic of Bartolomé de las Casas, and then we have airports, metros, etc., full of this type of propagandas, mostly using racialized children that obviously their parents never gave permission for the use of their image, with propaganda such as the one, for example, the first one that appears here, saying you have the power to change my present, no? Giving always this white middle class the power to change the life with their $10 a month to change the life of a poor child, no? I always say, like, yeah, they have the power to change your life with 10 euros, but they also have the power to deport you. They also have the power if they want to adopt you and take you away from your context. They also have the power to detain you in an immigrant detention center. And again, we see how these human rights industries, through their propaganda, maintain that same power structure, colonial power structure that we see in Bartolomé de las Casas, with the indigenous on his knees and him on top. Then again, we are seeing all these racialized people constantly being used, and obviously by this reproduction of this image against invisibilizing those responsible for this condition. Why these agencies do not work showing the faces of those who are responsible of the migratory control system, such as Fabrice Leguerida, director of Frontex, or why they do not put the face of the politicians, policemen, and people who were responsible of the murder of Osamuye Pitaye, Samba Martinez, or Idrissa Diallo, no? And then obviously always we have a young white woman that is going to save the children from this situation, no? And we don't have more time, so I'm going to end up here. I have I have only give like a simple explanation of these ways in which Europe uses legality, and mostly in regard to human rights legality. If any of you want to have more information, if you want to have the documents, if you want whatever, just contact me, and I am happy to share with you all the documents that I have showed today, and also to explain deeper on each document and each type of these processes. And then just to finish, well, I would like to say that even though the situation after the outbreak of coronavirus in the context of Spain and then worldwide also is uncertain. I mean, like, it's a virus. We don't know how it's going to develop, what is going to happen, no, what is going to be the outcome. Even though there is this uncertainty, it's important that we know that the institutions, the colonial power, the racist power is going to be there. It's not going to disappear. Even though now we are in a semi-state of exception in the context of Spain, it's not that the colonial racist institutional power has disappeared. It's just actually more present and stronger. And I'm not going to go deep on the ideas that we have been discussing with different people and anti-racist groups here of what is going on, but it's really important that we are really aware of what is going to come, because we are sure, and we are seeing it already here with the situation of the police being able to detain and exercise violence towards migrant and racialized people with the excuse of supposedly protecting people from coronavirus. So, well, with this I finish, and well, whatever you need, I'm around my computer. And thanks a lot for the space. Thanks a lot for listening. And I hope we are in touch soon. Bye.